One of the most common complaints I hear about politicians, or the most common feedback I get as a politician, is that you're all too uptight, you're all too straight-laced, you stick too much to the talking points, you're too boring, you don't really show us who you are as people. And frankly, I think often that's quite a valid criticism. So I am all for the Prime Minister showing a bit of levity, a bit of self-deprecation and, yes, engaging in a bit of a roast of others as well in public life. And I think that's an entirely healthy thing. Now, in this instance, it happened to be an off-the-record function and happened to leak, but I don't think it would be such a troubling thing if he gave a very similar speech in an on-the-record event.
We're talking about the President of the United States here.
Yes,
he's a volatile character.
And look, I can assure you that he's heard worse from others than the Australian Prime Minister. I don't think it's keeping him up at night. The Americans have a very similar dinner that they do, the White House Correspondents' Dinner. It's a very similar tradition where they engage in very similar kind of self-deprecation. I don't think that they'll be terribly shocked by it. It's a great dinner. It raises a lot of money for charity. I've been a couple of times. I didn't actually go this year, and I really enjoy the speeches, and I think it shows a lighter, more human side of our politicians, and I don't think that's such a bad thing. I don't think it's a terribly significant thing that it's leaked. I don't think the US Free Trade Agreement is going to be scrapped tomorrow, or the Marines are going to be withdrawn from Darwin, so I'm pretty relaxed about it. Look, it's a very difficult issue and something I worry about and think about a lot as a politician. As a profession, we've never been particularly highly regarded, but it seems at the moment we're even less well regarded than we used to be, both here in Australia and around the world, and we bear the lion's share of the responsibility of that, but I think technological change has contributed to it too. I think we should not forget that there are some really positive things about this change as well. I think one of the things about the evolution of Twitter and Facebook is that the public square is much more democratic than it once was. It's much easier for people to get an audience and to be heard, and they don't have to go through the gatekeepers that they used to have to go through in the media, where a single newspaper or TV editor had immense power and discretion over what was discussed and what wasn't discussed. So although I share some of Rachel's concerns, I don't think we should forget those positive things too. I think some of the really interesting things out of Uluru was a widespread agreement that symbolic recognition was not the way to go forward. It had previously been suggested by many people that we should have a preamble of some kind to the Constitution that would symbolically recognise Indigenous Australians, and the Uluru Summit was very clear that was not what they were after. They wanted more tangible results than that, and I completely respect and understand that. I also understand and respect why Aboriginal people feel that they want to have a greater voice in Australian politics and why they want better consultation, because there have been decades of failure in Indigenous policy of governments of both persuasions, so I understand that. There are some big questions to be answered, though, over the coming months about how those things are achieved, how those aspirations are achieved, and I do have some reservations about how we do it in the Constitution. I think there is constitutional risk in enshrining a representative voice of some kind in the Constitution, and I also think, as a matter of principle, that we should always ensure that all Australians are equally represented and have equal opportunity to be represented, and I don't like the idea of dividing Australians by race by saying that some Australians are represented by the Australian Parliament and other Australians are represented by another representative body. It is the job of the Parliament to represent everyone. I think that Section 25, as you said, is redundant and unnecessary. There'd be no harm if that was removed. Section 5126, as starting from a first basis of principles, I would prefer it not be in there. But one of the things that some Indigenous leaders have told us is if you took out 5126, that would damage, for example, native title laws, and would create uncertainty about native title laws. So while if we were writing a constitution today, it will include no references to race, it's in many in the Indigenous community who tell us we must have at least a power there to make laws for Indigenous people, whether it's for the promotion of culture or history or language. There must be some way of the federal government addressing these issues. And we've always, as a country, screened potential migrants for their skills and for their health and for their security and other things. But one thing which we haven't actually screened for in the past is values. And I think that's a really important part of being a migrant to Australia, and certainly if you want to become a citizen here. And some of the things that we're looking at, including in the values test in the citizenship application, is an acceptance and understanding that domestic violence is completely unacceptable in Australia. I don't think it's xenophobic to expect and to require new migrants to abide by that, or to respect freedom of speech or freedom of religion or equality before the law. I mean, these are principles that we seek to uphold and maintain in Australia, and we'll find that much more easy to do if all the new migrants who are seeking to become citizens share those values and a commitment to those values. I'm also very happy to defend a tough English language requirement. I think if you're seeking to become a citizen, which will be after at least 4 years as a permanent resident, you should be able to speak English, and it is important to be able to communicate with your neighbours and your colleagues and your co-workers and your friends in order to integrate successfully in society. It's not just good for the society, but it's good for you as an individual as well. Come back to Rachel's observations about her own upcoming test. I agree with her. Knowing Donald Bradman's batting average, as interesting as that is not actually a useful thing to study. And you know, all the other examples she gave. I'd much rather know whether, as a new migrant, they accept the principle of freedom of religion, which means that you can have faith or not have faith, that if you are of a faith, you can choose to leave your faith or change your faith. I mean, that's a really important thing that I think reflects the diversity that you're talking about.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I'm just saying I wonder who's determining what the values are.
You and I, Linda, will be voting on it in the Parliament, and if you're not happy with it, you can vote against it. That's the opportunity you have as a representative on behalf of everyone. But there is some good news on this front. There's an economist at Harvard University, Steven Pinker, who's tracked violence and conflict throughout history. And what he shows is it might not feel like it, but the age we're living in now is one of the most conflict-free, violence-free ages in human history. So that shows we're making progress. I know it doesn't always feel like that, but compared to the horrors of World War, what we're experiencing today is a much lower level of conflict and violence.
When I was 9, I started the Ape Family Foundation to raise money to help chimps and other primates at Taronga Zoo. As primary school students, we don't have a lot of power or influence, but what can we do to help prevent the destruction of natural habitats and the exploitation and hunting of primates?
James Paterson, you are the youngest ever Liberal senator. What advice do you have for a young conservationist?
Well, I'm a little bit older than you, but not a lot older than you. And it wasn't all that long ago that I was in school and I was passionate about things and I was reading things in the newspaper that made me angry or that I wanted to get involved in. And what I've found is that the barriers to be involved and have influence in public policy and political life in Australia are actually very low. And I think they're lower than they ever have been. And you could choose, like me, to do that through a formal political system and join a political party, or there are many other ways of doing it. There's lots of other organisations that are dedicated to causes or activism, like Jane's and many others. So I think there's just so many opportunities to have influence if that's what you're passionate about. And if you want to dedicate your life to that, you can have a very satisfying life making a difference to the things that are important to you. I'm very fortunate that I came into the Parliament after the leadership change in my party, and so I had no involvement in it. And one of the things that, because of that perspective that I have, that I've become really clear to me is that so many people invest their frustrations and their anger or their hopes in a particular leader as if it's down to that one leader, and if we just change the leader, everything will be good or everything will be bad. In politics, if you're unhappy with the system and the policies you're getting, the leader is much a symptom as they are a cause. And just as people have invested their hopes in Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn and Emmanuel Macron, I think ultimately they will be disappointed in them because it's not... We don't live in a democratic dictatorship where a leader can just impose their will and dictate to the country what's going to happen, what's not going to happen. And frankly, I don't think it'd be a very good thing to live in a system like that. So if you want change, then it's about much more fundamental, deep down things than who's the one leader of the day.